Hi again. We are ready to get started on our second presentation, compliance programs from creation to implementation. And we have a very dynamic group here today to speak on this from Principal. We have with us Jeff Hicks and Carrie Farrell-Kolb, who are both corporate counsel from Principal. We also have Karen Schmidt, who's the Assistant Director of Corporate Ethics. And we also have Amy Anderson, who is the Chief Compliance Officer from Principal. I'll let them talk a little bit more about themselves and introduce themselves to you guys.
All right, thank you very much. Thanks for having us here. We thought we would start by giving a little bit more background information about ourselves and our role within Principal. I think you'll see that depending on our specific roles that we each have a little bit different perspective or focus when it comes to implementing and structuring a compliance program. So again, my name is Carrie Farrell-Kolb. I'm probably the newest member to Principal out of this team. I just joined Principal in March of this year. Prior to that time, I was in private practice for several years at a law firm here in Des Moines. I practiced in the employee benefits ERISA area. And after that, I also spent about 3 years as the Director of Compliance for an employee benefit consulting firm. So I have sort of both that legal background and experience as well as a compliance experience. At Principal, I have joined their legal team, and I support what we call our Retirement and Income Solutions business unit. We call it RIS. We like to use a lot of acronyms at Principal, and so I'm still learning those and trying to keep them straight. But I work a lot with Amy Anderson in that business unit and her compliance team. So that's sort of our connection. I'll let you go ahead and tell more about yourself.
I'm Karen Schmidt. I work in the corporate ethics and compliance area. And just to make clear, Principal has kind of a business-centric model for our compliance program where we have a centralized aspect and a decentralized aspect to the program. I work with the, you might call centralized aspect, the corporate ethics and compliance, and Amy will talk more about the business unit aspect. I work with the Principal's Chief Compliance Officer and assist her in carrying out the ethics and compliance program. My focus on our team is more on the ethics side. However, I do get heavily involved with compliance as well. So you'll have to allow me a little bit of time to talk about ethics. That's just going to naturally come out. So I'll apologize for that up front. But it's an important part of the compliance program. I've been with the company 38 years. A lot of my career was in internal audit, and about the last 12 years or so, I focused on ethics and compliance.
Good morning. Can everybody hear me? Thank you for having Principal present today. Hopefully, as Carrie said, you'll see the fluidity between what I call the real lawyers on either side of me and the people in compliance. While I'm a lawyer by training and I still maintain my license, I am not a lawyer at Principal in my Chief Compliance Officer role. I did practice with Principal for 10 years, and then 15 years ago, I moved into the business and became the Chief Compliance Officer over our retirement business. And I have about 140 employees who work with me. So it's sort of, we have core compliance, but I also have responsibility over what I would call highly regulated operations that are part and parcel of running a retirement operation.
My name is Jeff Hicks. I'm in the law department. I handle the litigation, not the litigation, but I handle litigation as well as internal investigations. I've been with Principal about 2 years, and before that I was with Faegre. And I'll probably be silent for the good first 30 minutes of this, which is great. And it's because Karen and Amy really will be able to talk about the compliance and setting up the compliance piece. And then I'll probably chime in closer to the end, just because I think one tie-in is, when does the law department get pulled in to provide that legal advice? And one of the things I just was going to touch on is just nothing that you probably haven't heard of before, and isn't in some ways common sense, just in terms of internal investigations and specifically just some things to think about when you conduct the interviews specifically. So with that, I'll sit back for 30 minutes.
All right. All right, so we're going to just start with kind of the basic question, how do we structure a ethics and compliance program? And I thought maybe we'd start with Karen from more the corporate overall perspective. Do you want to provide that?
Sure, thank you. Of course, you have to lay the foundation and make sure that everybody's on the same page when it comes to a compliance and ethics program. We have an ethics and compliance program charter. It is signed by the CEO, and it has to be approved by our nominating and governance committee of the board. So that really is the high-level foundation for the program. And it discusses the high-level aspects of the program, the structure, authority, the funding for the program. Retaliation is a major aspect that we want to make sure that we address on a corporate level, and independence. Our chief, I want to say PSG, and I know I'm not supposed to say that.
More acronyms.
Principal CCO that I report to has a dotted line to the audit committee. And so that addresses part of the independence aspect of the ethics and compliance program. She does have overall oversight for the program, but she works very closely with the business unit chief compliance officers. And as a team, they really work together to carry out the program, decide what the strategy is going to be, prioritize. So it's very much a team effort between the principal CCO and the business unit CCOs. Some of the things that the team that I work on is called the corporate ethics and compliance team. And some of the things that we do get involved with are the corporate policies, setting up the fraud hotline and monitoring it, and that's where Jeff will get involved with when he talks. Of course, most companies have a code of conduct, and our team is responsible for developing that, maintaining it, do training. We have annual training on our code, and it is required to be done by all employees and certified that they have read our code and comply with it. And that's required by all 15,000 employees. So our team gets to follow up on that and make sure that all 15,000 people have done that. That's a fun project. Our team also has we have a chief privacy officer on our team, so he gets very involved with the information security privacy aspects of the program. AML, OFAC are a couple of key projects handled by our team. Pay to play for political contributions. So our team can get involved on those aspects that cross a major portion of the company. They're not really a business operation specific compliance issue, but very much a broad corporate issue. And lots of those kinds of issues come to our team to implement and monitor.
Amy, you want to give your perspective from the business unit?
Sure. So as Karen said, there are about 15,000 employees. So how we have 4 CCOs who are up against the business unit. So international or asset management, I'm retirement. And then Tracy Weldon is US kind of life annuity operations. And so there is that hub, and then we have the corporate CCO. And so for my area, and I think probably all of you are familiar with the federal sentencing guidelines. And so that is the pole star. And I think it's a very interesting thing where it creates, I would say, as a CCO, what I try to do in the business unit is when there are problems, and of course there are in any complex organization, is you know, that early detection, and you want to hold them up, you memorialize them, and it's not, and this is what I think is an interesting discussion, is when does attorney-client privilege come in for legal advice? But as a compliance professional, I think it's really critical because the thrust of that law is there's a lot of transparency about identifying those problems, describing them, and we have a very robust sort of programmatic system that where it is, our internal audit, legal, several stakeholders can see every compliance issue we've worked on for many years going back. And so that's an interesting thing to work with your corporate counsel about, how you also make sure you are protecting attorney-client privilege when you're asking for specific legal advice. I think any kind of modern compliance program you're dealing with, things fall off the track, how to, just identify those, make it right. Fraud, anti-fraud efforts are ginormous. Privacy, that can sometimes be part of fraud. Ethics, I also work really closely with our partner, Ernst & Young, who we have a SOC 1, a SOC 2. That's something that's run out of our compliance shop. Ad review, writing contracts that are sold to our clients. So there are many functions that now come under compliance, and I work closely with other CCOs in the retirement space, and I would say there's just a lot of activity, and a lot of lawyers are also, it's kind of exciting, are coming straight into the compliance profession right from law school. It's now something that they have identified they want to be in that space. They want to kind of be a little bit more maybe in the business environment, and they're coming right into compliance.
All right, so I know one key aspect that we've talked about among our conversations and in our company a lot is sort of establishing tone from the top. When we're setting up and we're structuring an ethics and compliance program, it's really, really important to have that message from the top. Do one of you want to talk about that and sort of how that has happened and how that's played out?
There are the formal documents that lay out that tone from the top, have your mission and your vision, your core values. One of our core values is integrity, and when we get around to doing performance evaluations, we have different competencies, core competencies, and one of those specifically talks about ethical business practices. Then we have message from the CEO in front of our code of conduct, and when we do our CBT training, we have a little video of him talking about compliance and ethics. So there's all of those very formal, documented ways of laying that foundation for tone from the top. But a lot of companies have that and still does not
miss the mark.
Yeah. Back in the day, we always laughed about how thick Enron's code of conduct was. It was like 50 pages.
It took a long time to shred.
It did. The difference, I feel, at Principal is you have leadership walking the talk. They truly believe in it, buy into it, and know that as a company that provides financial services, we are selling trust. And you hear them talk about that a lot. So it's really of course we do all the formal stuff, but it's really the actions of top leaders. And we do focus, we try to make sure that when we're doing different communications from our team, preparing different communications, that we get comments from top leaders supporting where we're headed as a company. And one example I like to use, it was just very unique, and it just showed the belief system of executive management at Principal back when they had the mass shooting in Orlando. Within the 2 days, the executive management group sent out an email to all employees talking about diversity and what we stand for as a company. And I thought that was truly unique and really showed what the values are of senior execs at Principal. So I think that carries a lot more weight than the formal stuff that we do have to have.
I would say with BU compliance, one thing I've noticed over the years is we're seeing other risk professionals kind of pop up, chief risk officers, chief privacy officers, chief of the customer experience, lots of chiefs are out there and everybody's wanting a seat at that business table. And the reality is the business is only going to allow so many folks at the table who don't have profit and loss responsibility, bottom line accountability for the business. So I think with Principal, I'm happy to say that the compliance program is really so mature and arguably maybe more mature than some of those newer fields we're seeing, that we are clearly at the table with senior management. We're on the strategic. We actually have a vote at the strategic working group. We're on the operation committee, the product committee. I am, and so you have a lot of access to what's happening with the business, so you can be part of sort of real-time kind of compliance consultation, right, on the fly. And also you can help legal risk, internal audit. You can help bring in the right people to those conversations, because not everybody can be at every meeting all the time. And so you have your business stakeholders, but you really have to take care of your kind of colleagues in the risk community, like the CROs, internal audit, legal, and just make sure you're trying to bring as much transparency to them so they can, help guide the business and make sure the business ends up at the right decision. So I think that's probably the most critical part. You cannot be on the outside of that circle. You really need to be in, not just with reporting up through the audit committee. You don't want that to be pro forma. You actually want to be, thought of as kind of one of the gang and be in the room and at the table.
All right, some good thoughts. So now that we've kind of set out how we structure a compliance program and have that tone from the top, can you guys talk a little bit more about sort of the details about how it's implemented and the types of things that go into that?
From a corporate perspective, I already mentioned that we have a code of conduct and our process to make sure that that's getting out to all employees and that they're aware of it. Then from the code of conduct, then it goes to a little bit deeper level of having corporate policies. And those go into, you might have gifted entertainment that goes into a little more detail and privacy, more detail than the code does. One of our challenges at Principal with being a global company is making sure that as we get down into more detail of how we conduct our business, that we continue to conduct business as one Principal, that we don't have offshoots that are kind of going off a whole different path. And so our policies, we are structuring those so that there is at least a corporate level. We're all on the same page when it comes to these different topics. Then there are some reasons that some areas might have to do things differently because of the jurisdiction they're in and different laws. And so then we have standards that may vary. So you may have a gift and entertainment global policy, but then you may have standards that apply to this business area and address their requirements, and another set of standards that are for another area, but they're both based on this global direction so that we can continue to make sure we're headed down the same path. So that's been something that we have been working on the last several years. Because to be honest, earlier on, as we grew, it was a challenge for people in Des Moines to think in terms of writing policies that applied all around the world. And so we've had a major initiative to get that more under control and be one Principal. And hopefully that will be done by the end of this year. We have a corporate policy committee that has representatives from around the organization. And if a policy is decided that it's going to be corporate, it must come through that committee for review and approval to be a corporate policy. And that committee makes sure that we're being consistent. We don't have policies that are conflicting with each other, and making sure that we're following the same format of putting out corporate policies. Then the next kind of level is communication and training. At a corporate level, we have a communication plan that's a 3-year plan. And for the major topics that are covered in our code and our corporate policies, we have a plan of how often are we going to remind employees about that particular aspect. We may publish articles on our intranet site that goes to all employees, or it may be an email that's more targeted to a certain group. But we have a 3-year plan that spells out what training or what communication we're going to do and what mode we're going to use. Then we also have at a corporate level, a training plan that again kind of lays out what kind of training we want to do on the major topics. But then when it gets to the business unit level, then they have a responsibility to go much deeper into what training is needed for their particular operation. So our training plan is very broad and addresses topics that cover a wide swath of the organization. So training and communication are key.
Principal really has taken the stance that, I mean, we're now hearing executives say we are competing with compliance. We really do believe, many of you are probably familiar with the Department of Labor fiduciary reg that's been around the last couple of years. We really saw that as an opportunity to compete with compliance. So when I think of my compliance organization, there is, you know, just what I always call it kind of bread and butter. It is, what are the laws and the regulations we're seeing from the Department of Labor, the IRS, the SEC, state, you know, securities departments, state insurance departments that we need to comply with. And, you know, we have a very systematic approach where what's the reg, what does it say, what day is it effective? And then most of those are associated with, you know, kind of a mini project where it is business and association with compliance and legal, you know, we're just making sure we're working on that to make sure it's something that will be implemented on time. The other chunk is, you know, compliance issues. As I said before, things fall off the tracks, and that is something that is memorialized as a problem. And then we do what we call a root cause analysis. We get down to the kind of the bare bones about what happened, how did this happen, how do we ensure it never happened again, how do we, you know, proactively make the customer right, and that is, you know, another bucket. Another thing we spend quite a bit of time on is complaints, and in this day and age with email, social media, that is really major. And I am a fan of compliance because I think it is really critical for anyone in compliance to, and very much including the chief compliance officer, to be very hands-on on complaints. That's the data that where you're going to start to see things and start to make sure, and we track and trend them and categorize them. So we're making sure that if we're starting to see, gosh, we're hearing a lot of complaints here or there, that we would then proactively work with the business in consultation with law and get at that. In addition to sort of written complaints, I also listened, 2 hours a month. I wish I could listen to more calls on our call center line, and that is fascinating just to hear, you know, just what our customers are saying, how our call center representatives are answering them. And that gives me a lot of data about some things that I maybe want to do on a proactive basis to help work with the business to maybe sharpen a focus in an area or two. Finally, and many of you may be familiar with Salesforce, we're working with Salesforce as you know, they are, have some really interesting tools where they're capturing on a customer sentiment. And so I am there and working with our folks who are our Salesforce reps. I'm trying to get in on that action from a compliance perspective to try to discern if, anger or upset or disappointment, if it's actually kind of a first or second cousin to a budding compliance problem. And that's been really interesting because I think all of us are challenged to try to use data quickly to identify risks and put together a proactive plan. So I think there's a lot of interesting things going on in the business. And I'm sure many of you probably have your own versions of, we call it PMO, Project Management Office. That's where you go and fight for resources. I never dreamt I would spend so much time because in a company the size of Principal, and many of the folks that your businesses or people you represent, is it's all about the system. I mean, you can have 100% compliance if those systems are working as they should. And so we spend a lot of time with our systems folks making sure business requirements and testing and it's actually operating right. And then when it's not, to identify, make sure we're in line quickly to get resources as soon as possible.
Yeah, and I think that's important from a legal perspective. I know we work together a lot on both proactive pieces where we're trying to implement things and make sure that if we have a new law or regulation that it gets implemented correctly, that our systems are set up correctly. But then also from a reactive perspective, that doesn't always happen. I mean, we'd like to say that 100% of the time it's implemented 100% correctly, or maybe there's different interpretations or things change over the time. So there can be a reactive approach as well, where we're trying to fix things, and I think law and compliance work together fairly well in both of those types of situations.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you kind of touched on this, Amy, about how do we know if it's working? And I know you talked about complaints and sort of the call center, and those are, I think, some things that right away we might see, oh, we might have some problems that we have to address. But what are some other kinds of things, like in terms of testing or controls, that we have in place to know if things are working?
I guess I'll jump in on that. I would encourage anyone in the compliance space to really form a close bond with your internal audit staff. I mean, I think that needs to be leveraged for every compliance program. And I'm also lucky enough that we have, we spend quite a bit of money, and I leverage this completely on EY. They are also, in addition to our internal auditors, they're in there heavily in our retirement business. And I meet with those folks, I see their findings, and I leverage what EY does as well for my compliance program. So that's testing that I'm not going to duplicate, or our internal auditors are not going to duplicate. So I think it is really, making friends with the other risk professionals and pulling their work into your compliance program. And that awareness and leveraging it, I think, is a really wise thing to do. And then we, of course, do some testing on our own. And it tends to be where we think there are hot spots that need some additional testing. And every year we kind of have a proactive plan about compliance testing issues where we're going to dive in. And then as issues come up, we sometimes pivot.
I would just add too that there are the formalized controls in different SOX testing, SOC 2, FICA or FICA. I don't know how you pronounce it. FICA. So there are those that do hit on some key aspects of compliance. Another aspect, and this might be more from an ethics perspective. I warned you I would be talking a little bit about ethics. The employee opinion survey that the company does that goes out to all employees. And we have ethics specific questions, or maybe I shouldn't say they're ethics specific, but they're questions that we feel give a little bit of flavor of what the perceptions are out there about their coworkers, their leaders, their business areas as far as ethical conduct. And our team does an analysis of the responses on those questions. And then we provide that information out to the different business areas so that they can take a look at that and see if there are any actions. Knowing whether your ethics and compliance program is working and measuring that is always a major topic at any professional organization that is talking about ethics and compliance, because it's tough. So I think most organizations continue to struggle a little bit in that area.
Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about, I know, Amy, again, you mentioned the call center, but our alert line or our fraud line and the different avenues, the different ways that people can call in complaints or the different avenues that they have to do that?
We do continually market that you have options for how you're most comfortable reporting. And one of them is the fraud hotline. It does have an anonymous aspect. We try to educate people that it truly is anonymous. There's just in surveys that go out to all different companies, there's that skepticism on this day and age. How is it really anonymous? Can't they get back to my phone number? Can't they get back to my computer? And our explanation is no, we really can't, because we work with a third-party vendor on the hotline. And it's in the contract that they will not provide us with any of that kind of data that would lead us back to a reporter if they chose to be anonymous. So we continually try to get that message out. I was just looking at a survey yesterday, though, that said on average, 65% of employees go to their leader. And while the hotline is important, having your leaders up on how to handle a situation when an employee comes to report something is key. And that's an area, we do have a leader's guide at Principal for leaders and a one-page kind of cheat sheet on things to keep in mind if somebody comes to you. It's so important to thank the employee and not try to come up with reasons why that happened that would explain it away, and assure them that it will be looked into. So really, while the hotline's important, I think getting the leaders trained on how to handle situations is just as important, if not more. Was that the question you asked me?
Yes. It was good.
I get on a roll on that.
Yeah. Did you have anything to add to that, Amy? Or you?
One thing I'd mention, and this may resonate with folks in this room, is one thing I've noticed with people reaching out in complaints is that they are really reaching out to like the CEO or members of our board of directors. Folks are very competent at figuring out how to contact those individuals. And so as a BU compliance professional, you want to make sure you have a well-oiled communication path with, say, your CEO to bring those back down in the business unit, because a lot of times they are absolutely routine issues and there's not anything. But sometimes when it gets in sort of that sphere, it can take a lot of resources, and it can kind of be blown out of proportion. And we are seeing more and more, I mean, weekly, daily, where our CEO and our senior people are being pinged. And that is, it's kind of, we don't want to dilute that, because sometimes it probably belongs there, but a lot of times it doesn't. And also we are seeing with the fraud, with the alert line, for instance, we are seeing a lot of panicked customers. And it seems you really see it on Saturday and Sunday when maybe they go to, say, for instance, check their 401k balance and say it's gone. So they have ignored their employer's messages that they went to a new provider. So it's with Fidelity. It's not gone. But it is something where you're starting to see people are so inundated with so much information. But that's something I watch carefully, because we always want to look and make sure it's not gone. It's actually with another provider. But if you started to see 20, 100 of those, you know, we're all worried about, you know, any kind of large-scale cyber attack. And so that's also an interesting thing where that alert line does bring a lot of, I would say, kind of panic folks who have not kept up on their communication with their employer about their retirement plan, because that's a very real venue. And then Facebook, people put stuff on Principal's Facebook, social media, you know, about us. And reputational risk, we've just got to mention that. I mean, that's a big part of what legal and compliance, corporate compliance, BU compliance, we're very focused on managing that reputational risk.
So Jeff, I think we're about ready for you to talk. You've been sitting very patiently over. It's really hard. I know. I know you've been very patient. So at what point do we bring legal into this whole mix? And I think we've talked a little bit about this from a business unit perspective and being more proactive, trying to get in when we're implementing different things so that we can sort of get the right structures in place and make sure we're in compliance. But things do happen. Things fall off the track, as Amy says. At what point do we bring legal into the picture for more of a reactive approach?
And I think part of it is just a function, too, of how big your company is. You can't have law coming in every single time. If it's just more of kind of run-of-the-mill issues, I don't think we'd add any value that the compliance folks couldn't do themselves and do it better. On I'd say the bigger incidents, and even if it's unclear if it's going to be a big incident, I like to be brought in early, just because I like to get an early assessment as to whether or not we think it might turn into a big issue, because it's frustrating coming in and finding out there's been already 3 meetings and meeting minutes and a SharePoint site that's set up, and folks are running out trying to gather information. I like to get an early sense, and I think it's wise to have law in there just to get an early sense to say, you know what, this smells like it could be messy. And thinking about, okay, let's put attorney-client privilege on this. And I think it's important, at least the way I look at it, I don't look at it that now I'm going to do all the work. It's just a matter of really getting the communications in place to say, listen, I need you to go do this and come back, and really documenting to the extent that if you have to fight on the attorney-client privilege piece, you have those emails or those memos saying that I've been asked to provide legal advice as part of that. I need you to go do this and report back to me. I also find when you put the attorney-client privilege on, it tends to limit the number of emails, and emails are horrible. I mean, just the amount of emails that go by, and we had a CLE speaker internally in Principal, and they were talking about cybersecurity, and his mantra was, it's an incident until you have the facts to determine whether or not it's a formal breach. He said, breach is a legal term of art and it's just an incident. And he would give examples of where maybe you don't, because it wasn't a breach, you didn't have to do any formal notification. But then when the regulators come in and say, we have 12,000 emails among your employees talking about how big of a breach this was, and now you're saying this wasn't a breach. And so I think it's just, law can provide some perspective early on about how to manage the investigation, knowing that at the end, it may be a packaged product that we have to or want to turn over to the regulators at some point.
All right, so did you have any other tips or how you might handle an investigation, Jeff? Or?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably more art than science. I look at the investigations, the biggest piece that I tend to see myself doing is more on the actual interviews. And so I have a checklist that I run through, and part of it maybe from my military days was pretty checklist heavy, but I think it's nice to have something that you just run through to think through, okay, how is this going to end up? Who do I want to interview? Attorney-client privilege, who do I need to bring in? And really just run through that checklist. When it comes to the interviews themselves, and I warned you this isn't going to be something that's rocket science, but I always find that in-person interviews are so much better. Over the phone, you just don't get the body language, you don't get the reaction. I never do a recording, never do a transcript. I do have another person always in the room. I think it's very important to have that second person that's helping take notes to the extent, but also having a sounding board when you're interviewing an employee and 2 weeks later the employee saying, well, I never said that, or that's not what I was trying to convey. Having that other person in the room to say, is that what you heard? Because that was not my impression. I think the work that you do before the interview is even more important. And I think documents play a huge role of having the documents in front, understanding the background, and having an outline. You have to, I mean, the upjohn warning is something that you have to be prepared to do and really have documented both in your after action report or interview summary, as well as I always put it in the witness outline just to make clear that yes, there was an upjohn warning provided. I personally don't like doing a written, presenting the person with a written upjohn warning. They're usually already nervous enough in there, and then when you send them, you give them something and say, please sign this, and we'll start the interview. It just doesn't go over very well. And then I think the last thing I'd say is just anticipate the questions that you're going to get 99% of every interview that you do. And probably the first one you're going to get is, do I need a lawyer? And in a lot of ways, the questions, if you do the upjohn warning, you could reference back to that upjohn warning when you answer that sort of question. So I give them the standard, I'm not your lawyer. And then I usually follow on and say, you know what, why don't we get started? I'll ask you a few questions. As we go along, if you think you need a lawyer, we can certainly discuss as we go on. The other one will be, well, what happens if I don't cooperate? And I think most companies probably have a similar sort of thing where the answer is along the lines of, well, our company has a policy that employees are expected to cooperate with investigations and answer truthfully as part of this fact gathering. I usually follow up with, I'm not in management, so I can't say what your management would actually do. I'm just here to gather facts. So why don't we go ahead and get started? And then if you have some concerns, we can address those. And then the two other ones, I'm really getting my money's worth in here now. Along the lines of, well, who are you going to tell? And again, it all ties back to the upjohn warning. I reassure them that, again, I'm going to do everything I can to keep this confidential, but that confidentiality belongs to the company. And I think that's important to stress. And then the last thing is, and you hear this sometimes, is, can I tell you something off the record? And I can't think of a scenario where I've said yes, but I usually tell them, you know, I'm not comfortable doing that. Why don't you tell me what are your concerns about why you're not comfortable telling me about this on the record? And most of the time they end up telling you what they didn't want to tell you on the record. But I don't see really any upside to saying, let's take this off the record. It just makes it clear that this is on the record and walk through it. And then the last thing I would do is I always do I wouldn't say always, but most of the time always do a written summary of the interview. And I always put up the front, the top of that this was done just for your legal advice, that I gave the upjohn warning. And then I also put in just a sentence that says that this is not a transcript, this is not a verbatim summary, and that it includes my own mental impressions and legal analysis, just because that really does provide at least an argument that it's more attorney-client privilege protected. So. Whew.
Great job. Amy or Karen, do you have any other thoughts on when you bring in legal, how you interact, those kinds of things, or any other specifics on that?
I would say I bring in legal all the time. And it's interesting because Jeff is on the litigation side, and so that is a different, maybe a different fact pattern. I would say Carrie, for instance, we work closely. That's when I talked about all those laws and regs, or, legal interpretation, or bouncing off, when something falls off the track. What do you think? What do you think about the remedy? So I would say, it's daily interaction with the law department. And I think the more sort of, the closer you can be with your compliance can be with legal and legal can be with compliance. I just think it's just the more protective for the company.
So I know, Amy, you had mentioned a little bit ago about reputational risk, and that has become, I think, a really big thing at Principal. I know I've heard our general counsel talk about just because something is legal doesn't mean that you should do it. And I think that has started to influence, you know, me as a lawyer within the company, our advice that we provide or sort of the direction that we might provide to the business unit. But do you want to talk more about that and sort of the importance, I think, of addressing that? I don't know, Jeff, do you want to mention the sort of the background for that, of why we really have started to take a look at that and take that very seriously?
I mean, I think a lot of it's just the social media. I mean, the United guy got, or was it a guy who got drug off the airplane, and how quickly that exploded. And it really becomes less of a legal question as to whether or not it's legal or not, or even if it's right or wrong. It really doesn't matter once it gets out there. And so we really implemented a more formal reputational risk team, incident response team type thing that really focuses on the reputational piece to make sure that we get the facts, but also we have the public relations, the corporate communications, really have that looped in. And most of the time the press never follows up. The complaint, it's a one-off, but just having that process in place. And I think it's also important to run the process through. It's new within Principal, a more formalized process. And like anything, it has some bumps, but I'd rather do the rocky testing on the little stuff that turns out to be nothing, as opposed to the big cybersecurity incident or the really big incident. So I really think testing it through the smaller stuff, even if it takes up, no one likes more meetings, but there is some value in doing that as well.
You know, to echo what Jeff said, I think for those of us who have been practicing law or in compliance for many years, it's just keeping your mind open to when you now have folks who are called brand ambassadors at meetings that feel fairly regulatory, and it is bringing a different voice to the table, and I appreciate it very much because they're looking at it from a very, very different perspective. And I think it's a really good exercise to bring, I mean, whether you call it, you know, your brand management team, corporate relations, whatever. I think to have them, I think they're growing a lot from seeing some of the nuts and bolts of what compliance and legal professionals deal with. And I think we're learning a lot from them about their perspective about sort of brand management. And you know, a brand, I mean, is a precious thing. And with reputational risk, I mean, as we all know, it can be affected very quickly.
I would just, as Jeff said, this is fairly new at the Principal as far as reputational management being part of our plan. And I think it's going to be really critical to make sure that leaders throughout the organization understand what kind of issues can come up that would fall under this category and be aware of the plan. And I'm not sure what kind of training can you talk about. Are there plans, or is that still too early to talk about?
Yeah, no, there's a formal plan, and then we do some training for the people that we anticipate might be involved in those meetings. So I think that training is important. Should we open up to questions? I don't know if are we close to the time?
We are getting close, I think, about 4 minutes. So what questions do you guys have? Any questions for us?
I'll mention one thing, and maybe you have seen it in your complaints. I'm seeing more and more, I hate to, you know, threat, but it's like, if you don't do X, I am going to social media. I mean, I am seeing that more and more. And again, that, you know, is something just to me to note in terms of how quickly you want to reach out to that person and try to get on the same page and resolve it. But I'm sure you're all seeing that in your own businesses, and the whole social media piece, as Jeff said, has really changed it. And I would say people are using it, are being fairly transparent about their intent to go to social media.
We do have a couple of questions that actually came from somebody who's on the webinar. Who is the chair or lead for the policy governance committee, how is that described, I think? And then what software programs do they use for policy training? So that's a question for you, Karen.
As far as the governance, the chair or lead of the governance, I'm actually the chair of the Corporate Policy Committee. But then Greg Elming, who is our Enterprise Risk Officer, and Betsy Happy, who is the Principal Chief Compliance Officer, are the two that are the sponsors of that committee. So as a committee, we report to the two of them.
Okay. And then can you talk about software programs that we might use for our training?
Right. We have in the past been, if we're doing a computer-based training or a CBT, we have in the past developed those internally. And we typically will put those on our learning management system that then pushes it out to all employees. And that allows us to have a process in place that checks off if they completed it or not. So the learning management system is really key as far as the documentation and getting information out.
So it's proprietary right now, the system, but I think like everything everybody's looking at outsource, you're seeing more products out there.
And we are moving that direction now too, where we're using a vendor to help develop our training.
I think maybe we have a couple minutes. Does anybody else have any other questions? Otherwise, all right. Well, we just want to thank you again for having us here, for inviting us, and thanks for allowing us to come and talk.
Thank you.